Okay, I'm going to try this one more time and then I'm going to put it up on the YouTube. This is an introduction to the pre-Civil War period because if you don't understand, Reconstruction would mean nothing if you don't understand why the Americans, after 80 years of freeing themselves from the control of the British, started killing each other, massively killing each other in 1861. First, I want to make a comment about studying history. I've already had a couple questions about how long is the paper, and some people seem very preoccupied about interpreting history or even reading history. One of the problems is that a lot of people have learned history by memorizing dates, memorizing names, but never really understanding the context of the story. And history is a story. It's also a story that's manipulated. Someone said many years ago that it's manipulated by the story. The winner writes the history. The loser doesn't get to write history. Well, in the case of the United States and the American Civil War in particular, both sides write the history, and both sides justify the reasons for becoming involved in the war. Another fact about history is this. So please, my point is, please don't be afraid to open your mind and don't try to memorize dates and names. Learn the story. And I will try to help by these rather informal YouTube videos, PowerPoint videos. The other point is that you can't judge a culture 150 years ago by the standards and the paradigm of the culture that you were born and raised in. What happened 150 years ago was a different world. You could almost say it's a different planet. They were not like us. They didn't think like us. They weren't raised like us. And we don't really understand, or you couldn't really understand, unless you study it very, very carefully. I've been reading history since how many years? 1956 I read my first history book. And I've always kept an open mind about never prejudging what people did 20, 50, 100 years ago or whatever. That was their world. It wasn't mine. So you can only understand history in the context of the times it was made. The history of the pre-Civil War, you got to start someplace, so I'm going to start with the Mexican War. Before that, you could go back to other different points, but the Mexican War was an event that really increased the size of the United States by 1.2 million square miles, or it grew by 66% in just a couple years when the Americans defeated the Mexicans and took over, you can see on a map, the southwestern United States. Texas becomes a state. The Americans begin pushing west because there's gold in California, there's gold and silver in Colorado, and there's land. And this is another thing that people in our modern world, so-called modern, don't understand, that in those days it was mostly agriculture, and farmers dream of land. 1 acre, 2 acres, 10 acres, not a lot of land, enough to go into the forests of Kentucky and Tennessee or further west and get a piece of land and build a small house and live a what we would consider extremely crude life, but it was theirs. There was the independence, the individualism of the American people at that time exhibited itself in this drive to the west. I need to say something about the difference between the Northerners and the Southerners in this context. The Northerners, New England is Massachusetts, where I lived before I came to Ecuador, and Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, that's New England. And then to the west is New York, and then to the south of New York is Pennsylvania, and then a little to the west is Ohio, and so on. Those people were less farming, less rural, backwoods people, and more urban, more industrialized, And being the goal of immigration in the 1840s and the 1850s in particular, much more diverse cultures. In the South, it was much different. And South would be, if you look at a map, Virginia, Kentucky, south, everything south of Virginia and Kentucky. That's the southern United States. And that was a very different culture. It was a slave culture. It was a culture of genteel plantation owners who may have owned 50 or 100 slaves. But most people didn't do that. Most people, if they had any slaves, had one or two to help around the house. I think you would, in Peru, would call it the same empleadas, house people that you didn't own a lot of property, so you didn't really need a lot of field hands. The bitter fruit refers to the Mexican War, that the Southerners, they saw an expansion to the West should be open to slave states. The Northerners saw the slave states, the idea of slave states, furthermore slave states, as an insult, that the Southerners' way of life was so different than the Northerners' way of life, and the Southerners were insistent on preserving their, what they called the peculiar institution of slavery. After the Civil War, and ever since the Civil War, there's been a lot of manipulating of the reasons for the Civil War, the Southerners in particular claiming they weren't fighting to save slavery, they were fighting for the rights of states which were being trampled on by the potentially Northern-dominated Congress of the United States. They were offended by the constant insults of the Northerners for their way of life. And if you look at this map, you can see, first thing you should notice when you look at the map, the southern states naturally, the Missouri Compromise was mentioned as a compromise of states, or territories rather, where if you look at the state of Missouri right in the center, north of that's the Iowa Territory, Wisconsin Territory, and unorganized territory. By 1846, the Wilmot Proviso said that slaves would be prohibited from these territories conquered from Mexico, these territories being Utah and California naturally. And in the Southerners, their point was this. What they said was, if you look at that little square or rectangle on the lower left, their fear was that the Northerners were going to have more power in the Congress. In 1789, there were 8 slave states and 5 free states. In 1800, there are 9 to 8. By 1821, it's 12 to 12, and 1837 is 13 to 13, and that is what dominates the laws of the United States is the Congress. They're the ones that introduce the laws, and in the House of Representatives, and then the Senate, they vote, and if the free states outnumber the slave states, they could pass a law prohibiting slavery in all the states. So the Southerners are very jealous of their system, and that's what they're going to protect. So what they said was, the Wilmot Proviso, that each new territory, people would move into the territory. Obviously, you can immediately say, but what about the indigenous, the Indians of the American Indians? Nobody cared about the American Indians. They were just in the way, and they were swept out of the way by massive, almost hordes of white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, Native Americans, and new immigrants coming into the country. The popular sovereignty was simply that the people moving into a territory, after it becomes somewhat populated, they could request to become a state, and they would vote whether they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. The Northerners believed that all the new territories should remain free until statehood was decided, but the Southerners were fighting to say, no, these new territories will be slave states. Compromise of 1850, which didn't last very long, was simply what it says on the slide there. New Mexico and Utah slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty, and California would be a free state. It didn't last long. No one was happy with it. In 1850, something very important happened. If you check out that URL on your slide, look at the Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel. Now, this is in a world where we think of giant bookstores that have it. No, and that wasn't the way it was. A bookstore may have maybe a couple hundred titles in the bookstore. In those days, a novel that sold 300,000 in the first year would be like 10 million or more today. It was the book of 1850. In 1862, the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she went to the White House to meet President Lincoln, and he said to her something like, "Oh, you're the little lady that this war is all about." The book was a story of slavery and how the Southerners treated slaves in the mind of the author. It wasn't really true, but the Southerners, or the Northerners rather, they became enraged by what they believed was the truth about the life of slaves in the Southern United States. Then along comes something called the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that any slave who escaped and could get to the North, by law, Northerners had to return the slave to the South, or Southern slave catchers could go to the North, and if they found a slave that had escaped, the law in the North, the police had to help them take the slave back to the South, drag them back to the South. And the Underground Railroad refers to people in the North. They were called abolitionists. They set up a door-to-door, town-to-town system. It wasn't underground. It wasn't a railroad. It was simply a way of passing escaped slaves from town to town until they could get them far enough north where they could cross over the border into Canada, where they would be immediately freed, or free people. The Kansas-Nebraska Act goes back to how this territory, the Kansas-Nebraska territory, is going to be divided, and the fighting over it. The slave people from the South, they moved many people into Kansas, most who didn't wish to stay there, but they wanted them to be there when there was going to be a vote on slave or free state. I put this in. There was also a conflict in the United. It was a very conflictive time in the United States for not just free states and slave states, but a lot of immigrants coming into the country, and they're clashing with the nativists. And one I thought was a very, very good movie with Daniel Day-Lewis, The Gangs of New York, and it's about the 1850s, where boatloads of Irish are coming into New York, and how they conflict with the nativists, because the nativists are, this is our country and our territory, and the nativists are Protestants and the Irish are Catholics, and there's an extreme anti-Catholicism in the United States at that time. But then you'd have to go back and understand the history of Great Britain, or England rather, all the way back to the 1500s, and Henry VIII, and throwing out all the Catholics and creating the Anglican Church of England. The election of 1856 proves to be the beginning of the Civil War. Is going to start soon. The slavery in territories was the main issue. Kansas in 1856 breaks out into a war between pro and for and against slavery, and even a senator gets attacked on the floor of the Senate. A northern senator is savagely beaten almost to death by a southerner, because he stood up and defended freedom and free new states and territories. Then was the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision, meaning it was a decision of the Supreme Court of the United States, was about a man who was a slave, and his owner, a U.S. Army officer. He was a slave in Missouri. The officer was transferred to Illinois, which was a free state, or Wisconsin, I forgot, doesn't make any difference, and then to another free territory, and then eventually back to Missouri. And Dred Scott with the help of a lot of people who were anti-slavery, sued for his freedom. The Supreme Court ruled that he was not a citizen because he was black and a slave. Therefore, he couldn't sue for his freedom. Again, it angered many people in the North, and the people in the South were cheering, and it was another great cause and great moment in American history where the Supreme Court upholds slavery right before the Civil War. I put Abraham Lincoln in here just because he becomes president in 1860. He's elected president in the fall of 1860. But he was a senator, but only one term, and from Illinois. Defended the humanity of blacks, but he never believed that blacks and whites could live together because whites were too prejudiced to give blacks full citizenship. In 1859, John Brown. John Brown was from Kansas. It was a guy with, I don't remember how many kids, but 10 or 12 or 15 kids. Very unsuccessful at everything he ever tried, but very anti-slavery. If you look at pictures of him, he looks like a wild man. But in 1859, he raided a U.S. military, a federal armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. The place was quickly surrounded by U.S. Army troops. He was arrested, and he was hung. One of the ironies of history is that the commander of the troops was Colonel Robert E. Lee, who later becomes the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia for the Confederates, because in 1861, when the Army officers, the serving Army officers in the U.S. Army, they had to make a decision: are you going to stay in the Army or are you going to go south to your home state? And Robert E. Lee chose his home state. South Carolina secedes right after Lincoln is elected because the Southerners felt that Lincoln, a Republican, was anti-slavery and that he was going to be able to force laws that would abolish slavery. And then in February 1861, the Confederate States of America is created. And this is what you should remember. The issues that caused the Civil War are the things I just mentioned. I put manifest destiny. Manifest destiny means that people felt it was their destiny, a God-given right to conquer the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Also, the difference between the slave southern states, the culture, the society, and the free culture of the North. Thank you very much. We'll continue with one on the Civil War.